How do you kill the vampires in this movie?
Quickly, thoroughly, with extreme prejudice.
A vampire?
Vampire.
A vampire.
A vampire.
Vampire! Vampire.
There are worse things out tonight than vampires.
I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire! I'm a vampire!
Whoa, 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 that was a lot. Maybe we should just back up to the beginning.
It was Buffy the Vampire Slayer who once claimed that the first vampire was a dinosaur. After a particularly malicious reptile cursed God, it prompted Satan to erupt a nearby volcano filled with blood, raining down on the beast and transforming it into the first creature of the night. While the myth of vampirism doesn't extend quite so far back in history, the first traces of them appear roughly around the same time humanity does. And when I looked into their roots, I realized Buffy wasn't as far off as you'd think. The journey from primitive mythical creature to A24 darling is a long one, but this video can sum it all up fairly concisely, and maybe explain why a character like Nosferatu is still culturally significant in 2025.
It's a mighty big cross you got there, Charlie. The question is, do you have faith?
Where vampires are found in history, religion is always present. Some myths claim Cain was the first of their kind, as all creatures descend from his line. Jewish myths told tales of Lilith, who was supposedly Adam's wife before Eve, and eventually abandoned him for the demon Samael. But aside from uncorroborated myth, the first instance of a creature later known as a vampire stems all the way back to the first human civilization in ancient Mesopotamia, somewhere between 3400 and 3000 BC. Multiple recorded myths from this period could be associated with vampires. The final lines of a Mesopotamian poem titled The Seven Evil Spirits of Assyria mention spirits that spill blood like rain, devouring flesh and sucking the veins. They can also be found several hundred years later in ancient Egypt. Sekhmet, daughter of Ra and goddess of war and healing, was said to have drank human blood to give herself power, and she was associated with eternal life and death, a paradoxical trait often attributed to vampires. Several thousand years later, the Babylonians had a story about 7 evil witches, not unlike the 7 evil spirits of Mesopotamia. Some people also interpreted them as aspects of one demon known as Lamashtu, though another name for Lamashtu was Lilitu, which is likely what gave birth to Lilith from Hebrew myth. In ancient Greece, Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft and magic, gave birth to a demonic creature known as Empusa. Empusa took the form of a young woman, seduced men, and drank their blood. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus journeys to the underworld where he attempts to communicate with shades, creatures who could only speak with humans after drinking the blood of sacrificed animals. Ancient India had the Vitalas, and the Hebrews had Aluka, a horse leech that feeds off blood from the throats of animals. We haven't even discussed the Greek Lemures or the Jiangshi from Asian mythology, but you can see a pattern here. While these mythical creatures weren't necessarily vampires in the way that we look at them today, the concept has been synonymous with every mythology, folklore, and religion throughout mankind's history. We saw Sekhmet as a vampire in the recent Castlevania series, and we may even catch a glimpse of some more in Christopher Nolan's upcoming adaptation of the Odyssey. But it was the original Nosferatu that gave us our first glimpse of them on the big screen, and the Robert Eggers remake may have taken us full circle. But in the years between witty letterbox reviews and ancient Mesopotamia, vampires have taken on every form imaginable, spanning across ancient poetry, medieval folklore, classic literature, black and white movies, 80s slasher horrors, superheroes, teen romances, and video games. This particular creature has survived in the minds of humans for as long as we've had semi-rational thinking. So I suppose one of the big questions I'm asking in this video is, why?
I'm from Waterloo, where the vampires hang out!
Moving into the medieval era, Christianity spread across more regions, and vampires became more associated with Catholic beliefs, especially in Europe. 12th century historians had accounts of revenants. In the 16th century, Jewish literature featured a story of an old woman who rose from the dead as a vampire and murdered hundreds of civilians. But in 1645, Greek librarian Leo Elatius wrote the first blueprint of vampires as we know them today. In his book, De Graecorum Hodie Corandum Opinationibus, he wrote the first blueprint of vampires as we know them today in his book. And as time went on, 17th and 18th century Europe began to see vampires as a genuine threat to society, not unlike witches. There are hundreds of historical accounts of vampire sightings, so how did people become so convinced of their existence outside of tales and myth? Well, lacking a modern understanding of diseases is partially responsible. Porphyria makes you sensitive to light, tuberculosis causes physical wasting, rabies sometimes causes rabid behaviour like biting. Digging up bodies of suspected vampires was not uncommon in medieval Europe. If someone's hair and nails continued to grow post-mortem, it was often thought to indicate some kind of life after death. Some diseases put people in a state where they were thought to be dead, inducing a coma, so when they came out of it, others suspected they had risen from the dead. Plagues also caused lesions that made people bleed from the mouth. Suspected corpses were dug up and checked for signs of vampirism. To be safe, they would either drive a stake through their heart, burn the bodies, sever the heads, or all three. Much the same as the Salem witch trials, there are harrowing accounts of townsfolk who conducted cruel practices on those they suspected suffering from vampirism, with the most famous example being Mercy Brown. In the late 1800s, farmer George Brown lost most of his family to various illnesses, including his daughter Mercy. She was suspected as the cause of this plight upon his family. The conclusion seems like a bit of a leap, but in times of grief and confusion, people often try to find meaning wherever they can. Mercy's body was exhumed. She displayed no signs of vampirism, so naturally, the townsfolk assumed she was definitely a vampire. Her remains were burnt, but not before cutting out her heart, burning it to ash, and feeding it to her ailing brother in the hopes to remedy his sickness. And her brother, to everyone's surprise, made a full recovery. No, he obviously died. Sadly, there are countless stories like Mercy's, and while it's easy to look back and laugh at the stupidity of our less educated ancestors, their beliefs played a large role in forming the classic tropes of vampires we're familiar with today.
You must drive this stake right through his heart.
Take that, vile fiend!
So much of what we know about vampires today comes from this one book, but Stoker wasn't the first writer to adapt them into consumable literature. In fact, there are a number of works that he clearly took inspiration from, but are far less known, and a lot of it has to do with sexism. Several poems could arguably be considered the first published work of vampire fiction, such as The Vampire, written by Heinrich August Ossenfelder in 1748. 1773 saw the release of Lenore, a poem by Gottfried Berger, the lines of which are later quoted in Bram Stoker's novel. Then, in 1797, Goethe wrote The Bride of Corinth, which tells the tale of a Christian woman forced to become a nun to prevent her marrying a pagan Greek lover. Her heartache drives her to death, after which she returns as a vampire. Then in 1818, London's New Monthly magazine published The Vampire, written by John Polidori, where a young man named Aubrey befriends one Lord Ruthven and follows him around Europe. Ruthven is a social pariah who indulges in the petty degradation of fellow members of high society, and after he tries to seduce a young maiden during their trip to Rome, Aubrey begins to realize that there is a darker side to him than he previously thought. A mystery ensues, and as you can guess by the title, Ruthven turns out to be a naughty little vampire. Funnily enough, Ruthven was based on Polidori's friend, Lord Byron, who he compared to a blood-sucking, energy-draining monster that preyed on high society. Polidori condensed vampires into human-esque figures and established the trope of them living amongst high society. This story marks a turning point where vampires transition from folklore demons to measured, alluring creatures that live among us. Up until this point, vampires were mostly associated with Austrian and Ottoman culture. Polidori challenged that stereotype by making his character an Old English figure.
I've gone by many names over the countless years.
Some 60 years later, Sheridan Le Fanu published Carmilla, the First Vampire. Carmilla tells the story of a teenage girl named Laura, who lives in a secluded castle with her father in Styria. One day, an injured woman unexpectedly turns up at their doorstep. The two girls form a bond during her stay and are bound together by a shared dream that Laura experienced as a child. They grow very close until Carmilla makes sexual advances on Laura, which she refutes. As time goes on, Laura's dreams worsen and she grows ill, until finally it's revealed that Carmilla is of course a vampire, preying on Laura among others. Carmilla eventually declares her love for her, but the feeling isn't mutual and the story takes a sour turn, with Carmilla later revealed to be the ancient Countess Marcella, and religion plays a major role in defeating her. And Nosferatu actually takes a surprising amount of influence from this story.
That was a dramatic entrance, Carmilla.
It was not meant to disrespect you. It was intended to unsettle a room full of men.
Carmilla is so interesting to me. It's the 17th century gothic horror equivalent of Call Me By Your Name, and it deals with a lesbian romance written by a man in a time where such things were forbidden. Carmilla is overshadowed by its successor, and it's easy to see why. A female-led lesbian love story was never going to be a big seller in 1872. Empowering women were a scary thought back then. Literacy rates among men and women were finally leveling out, and a woman who could read was far scarier than any blood-sucking monster. There were even standards for how and what women could read, as reading distracted them from carrying out their household duties. Nevertheless, it's a great book that could be read in a day, and I highly recommend that you check it out. Now, before we get on to
Count Dracula,
who is the centerpiece of this entire genre, we need to look into the real man before the fictional one. You may be familiar with the name Vlad Tepes, supposedly the real identity of our infamous Count. Vlad Tepes I was known as the Usurper, after stealing the throne from Mircea I, who was the voivode of Wallachia in the late 1300s. Just to be clear, this guy is not Dracula. While governing, he pulled out of the anti-Ottoman coalition, which annoyed his superior, King Sigismund of Hungary. Vlad was not popular, and only lasted so long due to a treaty with Poland, but after multiple attempts to overthrow him, Mircea reclaimed his position and imprisoned Vlad. Mircea had 6 children, 4 of them sons and 1 of them legitimate. Mircea's legitimate son, Mihail, ruled alongside his father from 1408 to 1418, when Mircea died. His position naturally implied he would succeed his father as voivode, which he did. But he was killed in battle 2 years later, and succeeded by his brother Dan II, who spent 12 years engaged in a bitter rivalry with another brother, Radu II, and they constantly went back and forth taking the throne from one another. The Ottomans wanted Radu on the throne, but Dan eventually killed him in battle, then later died in 1432 from yet another Ottoman invasion. As you can tell, the Wallachians and the Ottomans didn't get on. Another brother, Alexandru, succeeded Dan, but then died 5 years later in 1436. If you found that hard to follow, I don't blame you. But essentially, all of Mircea's kids kept taking the throne and then dying shortly after. While this was all going on, Mircea's illegitimate son resided at King Sigismund's court in Hungary, a man by the name of Vlad Tepes. Why Mircea decided to name his son after the person who usurped his throne is beyond me. By 1436, the throne had changed hands 19 times in 36 years, meaning on average, Wallachia had a new voivode once every 18 months. While the sons of Mircea dropped like flies, Vlad was buddying up to King Sigismund, who inducted him into the Order of the Dragon. This was a Catholic fraternity devoted to the protection of the royal family. Being accepted into the order basically meant you were a trusted ally to the king. This was a great honor for Vlad, and Sigismund declared him rightful heir to Wallachia. His brother Alexandru was still in power at the time, so he appointed Vlad governor of Sigishora in Transylvania. Vlad II ascended after Alexandru died, and over time, his name became more and more associated with the Order of the Dragon, even adding their emblem to his heraldry. This earned him the name Dracul, meaning dragon in Romanian, so Vlad Dracul finally ruled over Wallachia. This guy is also not Dracula.
Stay with me,
Dracul ruled as voivode, but he was a vassal under Ottoman control. Ownership of Wallachia was a little confusing during this period, but basically it switched back and forth between Hungary and the Ottomans. In 1442, Vlad's sons became royal hostages to the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, meaning he couldn't move against them without risking the lives of his heirs. His rule was messy. His loyalty jumped to and fro between Ottomans and Hungarians, and it seems like Vlad had very little agency in all of it. After contributing troops to the Varna Crusade, wherein the Ottoman Empire crushed the European forces, it put him in the crosshairs of Europe's rulers, and eventually, Vlad gained too many enemies to withstand. He was overthrown by a past rival named John Hyandi, and was killed in his attempt to flee from the invading armies. Hyandi installed Vlad's cousin Vladislav on the throne, as if the names already weren't confusing enough. So Vlad Tepes II was dead, but he still had 2 sons held hostage to the Ottoman Empire. One of his sons found himself in a similar position to his father, garnering favour among the Ottomans, who backed him to seize the throne from Vladislav in 1488. A son who shared his father's name, Vlad Tepes III, son of Dracul, otherwise known as Dracula. We finally got there. Dracula swore to exact vengeance for his father's death. It took 8 long, bloody years for Vlad to ascend, during which time he even turned against the Ottomans who tried to install him. He became known for his ruthless nature and bloodlust in battle. While fleeing from a defeat in 1482, he lined a field with thousands of impaled corpses to deter the Ottomans from pursuing him. This included babies and their mothers, and thus earned his famous alias, The Impaler. Even after he secured the throne, his thirst for blood remained unquenched. Shortly after ascending, he summoned 500 boyar nobles who had supported Vladislav and had them impaled. In 1459, he attacked the Transylvanian city of Brazor, burning down most of the city and impaling the men, women, and children on the chapel of St. Jacob. He became an enemy to everyone, even God. There are many tales of his cruelty, like when he invited local beggars to a great feast in Targoviste, only to lock them in a hall and burn it down. One of his preferred torture methods was to flay feet, rub salt in the wound, and have goats lick it off with their rough tongues. He boiled men alive in giant cauldrons and forced their fellow captives to eat them. Despite his flamboyantly evil nature, he met a rather unsatisfying death somewhere between 1476 and 1477, where he was assassinated while marching to yet another battle with the Ottomans. His head was decapitated and put on display in Constantinople for all to see. There are conflicting reports of his death and whether it was actually him who died in the ambush, which leaves just enough wiggle room for him to survive and eventually become the fictional character we all know. So that's Vlad the Impaler, but why do we associate him with Dracula?
Greetings, it is I, the Count, and it's time to answer that fascinating question.
Aside from the name, an excerpt from chapter 3 of Stoker's novel gives us our most damning evidence. We Sezlekis have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for lordship. Who was it but one of my own race who as Voivode crossed the Danube and beat the Turk on his own ground? This was Dracula indeed. Woe was it that his unworthy brother, when he had fallen, sold his people to the Turk and brought the shame of slavery on them. Was it not this Dracula indeed, who inspired that other of his race who in a later age again and again brought his forces over the great river into Turkeyland? Now all of this checks out for the Impaler, who crossed the Danube, went to war with the Turks and resented his brother. One of the more interesting theories speculates that Dracula was in fact all of his ancestors and namesakes, especially given that both Vlad Dracul and Dracula grew up far away from their homeland where no one would recognize them as an adult. In Stoker's novel, Dracula even goes so far as to claim he is descended from Attila the Hun, which carries its own implications. What if Dracula was Attila and survived under the guise of his descendants throughout history? It would certainly explain the ancient king's bloodlust and the fact that he was referred to as the Scourge of God. Stoker leaves his origins intentionally vague, and aside from this excerpt, the only textual reference to Dracula's vampiric origins comes from Arminius in the novel, who claims, "The Draculas were a great and noble race, though from time to time there were offspring to whom their contemporaries attributed having had dealings with the Evil One. They learned their secrets in scolomancy, among the mountains above Lake Hermannstadt, where the devil claims the 10th scholar as his due. In the records appear such words as Stragoica, witch, Ordog and Pakol, Satan and Hell. And in one manuscript, this same Dracula is spoken of as Wampir, which we all understood too well. Nosferatu actually references this scolomancy, where a woman says,
Like enchanter he was in life, Solomonar.
Which we can assume was a satanic cult devoted to understanding dark arts of the spiritual world. Having said all this about Dracula, Stoker's inspiration for the character is one of the single biggest misconceptions in the genre's history. While the Impaler was no doubt an influence on his character, there is another tale from Celtic folklore that almost certainly inspired him, and it may have even been the source for the conception of the character.
Most people don't even know Bram Stoker was Irish, or that he got his inspiration here. See, this land belonged to an evil old hooer named Abertag, right? And he drained people's blood and drank it like water. Locals tried to kill him, and he just kept rising, looking for more.
Like Dracula.
Fuck Dracula.
To understand more about Dracula's roots, we have to look at ancient Celtic myth and the story of Abertag. Abertag was the tyrannical chieftain in modern-day County Derry in Northern Ireland. A band of local peasants rose up in rebellion, killing him and burying him, but Abertag continually rose from the grave, feasting on bowls of blood to rejuvenate him. The peasants sought the help of a local druid, who told them to stab the chieftain with a sword made from yew wood, then bury him upside down and place a large rock on top of his grave. The druid's plan worked, and Abertag supposedly lies buried under the stone to this day, in a location you can actually visit, known as the Giant's Grave. But how do we link this to Bram Stoker? Well, as mentioned before, Stoker was Irish, and passionate about literature. It's not a stretch to assume that he was familiar with Irish folklore. But our best source for this comes from Ulster University professor Bob Curran, the author of a book called Vampires, a field guide to the creatures who stalk the night. He points out that Stoker frequented the family home of Oscar Wilde, where he learnt the history of Celtic folklore from Wilde's mother, who told him of Abertag. It's worth noting that the name Dracula didn't come in till much later. In Stoker's original notes on the novel, he originally titled the book The Undead, with Dracula originally named Count Wampir. One of the most telling pieces of evidence to support this theory comes from a sculpture in St. Patrick's Church in Monaghan. If you've read the novel or seen any of the movies, including Nosferatu, you might recall a scene with the novel's protagonist, Lucy Westenra, or Ellen in the film. The image of Van Helsing and her husband, William Westenra, huddled around her bed while Dracula torments her mind is a famous one. And it just so happens that St. Patrick's Church in Monaghan has a sculpture called The Parting Glance, depicting the very same scene. The sculpture is dedicated to one Mary Ann Westenra, and in my opinion, this is all too much to be coincidental. We can't confirm that Stoker visited this specific church, but he did travel all around Ireland for years while working for the civil service, so it's definitely within reason. And it would confirm that Stoker actively sought inspiration from his own country before any other. Curran also notes that the novel's theme resonates with Irish history. The tale of an evil landlord oppressing his local peasants is all too familiar for Irish natives of that time. None of this is to say that Vlad Tepes was not an inspiration, or that Abhatac was the main source. Given what we know about Stoker's Irish roots, it's undeniable that the Celtic myth had some kind of influence, but it could be that both sources were equally influential. Given the prominence of the genre and the testy political climate of Ireland, it's a smart decision to blend inspirations with other European cultures, but also a creatively fulfilling one. The novel's success is evidence of that.
We may as well get something out of the fact Stoker came here. Pillaged our legend and used it to
write the greatest horror novel of all time.
Was it worth a read, is it?
So why have I given you an insane lore dump instead of just talking about Nosferatu? Partly because Count Orlok is literally just Dracula. The original film was an unlicensed adaptation, which Stoker's wife ended up launching a lawsuit over. So to understand Nosferatu, we need to understand Dracula. People may not realize just how important Dracula is to our modern understanding of vampires. While most of the traits and tropes attributed to him were established in previous fiction, it was Bram Stoker's character who solidified them in canon. And when we look back through Vlad Tepes' legacy, we can see that it is one of overambition and failure. And the same is true for almost every depiction of the character we've seen since, including Abhatac. From Vlad I through to Vlad Dracula and Vlad the Impaler, we can see the story of ferocity and charisma brought down by overambition and cruelty. Dracula and his father both infiltrated another culture during their tenures as royal hostages, seducing their leaders and ultimately betraying them, much the same as the fictional Count. In Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula is only beaten because of his insistence to spread the uncursed plague upon men. He leaves his castle in Transylvania and smuggles himself into London, where he's forced to hide in the shadows and leave himself exposed for long periods of time. Despite all the murder, torture, and crimes against God, the thing that ultimately brings this tyrant down isn't sunlight or a cross or the heroic Van Helsing, it's himself. This is true in every iteration, except for one.
We are here encountering the undead plague carrier, the vampire, Nosferatu.
Nosferatu started as a rip-off of Dracula. That's not to diminish the cultural impact the film has had. It's one of cinema's most revered horror classics and one of the founding fathers of the horror genre. But from this unlicensed rip-off came something nobody could have ever expected. Generally, icons of the literary canon have a default setting. They're known for a specific version of themselves at a specific point in their life. Often they kind of seem stuck in place in our memory. Take Sherlock Holmes or James Bond or Hercule Poirot. Sherlock Holmes might have had various depictions that vary from young to old, but they tend to retell the same stories and pose the same conflicts. There are exceptions to this, especially in recent years. We've seen a lot of iconic fictional characters age, particularly in cinema. Luke Skywalker, Wolverine, and even one version of Sherlock Holmes have had movies centered around them as old men, long after their journey has ended. But it's usually a one-off, and we inevitably revert back to the status quo. This extends to all kinds of fiction. So rarely does a character cemented in history begin to age and develop consistently over time. But Nosferatu has broken the mold.
You know, it's only for the best.
Vlad Tepes III ruled as voivode of Wallachia. By the time of Stoker's novel, he's relegated to Count of Transylvania, and he's migrating to London because he sucked his land dry, both literally and metaphorically. Every Szekely knows who and what he is. They avoid him at all costs, which means he's running out of food, and they're gradually growing more hateful, which could eventually lead to uprising. In the novel, he dies before he can develop any further than this point in his life, but more recent iterations have explored what life is like for Dracula as he continues to age. If we look at the various adaptations of Nosferatu, we can see that the Count is evolving. His fire is almost burnt out, his appearance withers, his tyranny and thirst for battle have depleted. And without external fulfillment, he finally starts to look within. Werner Herzog's 1979 remake introduces a more desperate, sympathetic version of the Count. Herzog describes his Nosferatu not as a monster, but an ambivalent, masterful force of change. When the plague threatens, people throw their property to the streets, they discard the bourgeois trappings, and a re-evaluation of life and its meaning takes place. In the film, Dracula is framed more as a victim of his own nature than a predator that thrives on blood. Klaus Kinski, the actor who portrays Nosferatu in the film, describes him as a man without free will. He cannot choose, he cannot cease to be. A man who is suffering for love. This theme of loneliness has become more prevalent in Dracula canon in the late 20th and 21st centuries. What is eternal life if you have no one to share it with? We see the character outgrow his lust for power and flesh and begin a search for love and meaning. The Castlevania Netflix series explores this idea beautifully. The first episode tells a singular story, a tragedy about the infamous Count falling for a human who teaches him to look at the world through their perspective. He finally finds some kind of redemption in his love, only to have it torn away by the corruption of the church. This story completely flips the original myths on their head, posing religion as the force of evil. 2024 brings us yet another Nosferatu, and this iteration shows the character at his most dichotic. I was so careful to avoid the marketing for this movie because I wanted to save the reveal of his appearance for the cinema. After seeing what Robert Eggers was capable of in previous films, I couldn't wait to see how terrifying this monster would be. The film builds up to the reveal so well, and you grow more tense with every passing minute that brings you closer to seeing him. But when the time finally arrived, something strange happened. Orlok is revealed in pieces, sometimes in the background of a shot or out of focus, but when you eventually see his full face, it's not a climax. It's not shocking in any way, but it's surprising how weak he is. This man is wheezing, and every word that comes out of his mouth sounds like a huge strain. He's slow and gaunt and resembles a human far more than you'd expect. The mustache really distracts from the horror. I was admittedly a little disappointed, but once you understand what the story is trying to tell you, it makes sense. Count Orlok is at his weakest. His body is quite literally decaying, and he has no purpose or agency left in his life, relying so heavily on his familiar to enact his plans. All he seeks now is love, and he finds it in Ellen. When he professes his love to Ellen, we can't deny that there is some sense of hopeless romanticism about him. Even Ellen visibly gets wrapped up in it. And if we look at his words without the image of a monster, it reads entirely differently. Over the centuries, a loathsome beast, I lay within the darkest pit, till you did wake me, enchantress, and stirred me from my grave. You are my affliction. Your passion is bound to me. I cannot be sated without you. Remember how we once were. A moment. Remember. It reads like a Percy Shelley poem. If Nicholas Hoult had given that speech, you'd be putty in his hands. In the end, Orlok's demise is not the result of overambition, but of love.
The stench of their bodies was horrible. But I'd never been so happy.
It's important to note that every iteration of Nosferatu diverges from the original novel with its ending. Where Stoker's novel saw a group of men leading a mission to slay Dracula with stakes and knives, Nosferatu features Ellen manipulating Orlok and sacrificing herself to kill him. For 1922, this is incredibly progressive, and it reflects the cultural shift in our attitude towards women's role in society. This was a genre where women were posed as prey, and the message always advocated the dangers of refusing to repress their sexuality. But Nosferatu boldly went against the current. Ellen uses her sexuality to bait Orlok. She turns a perceived weakness into an advantage in order to manipulate the Count, then bravely sacrifices herself while the men blindly march out to try and kill a creature they have absolutely no understanding of, and the predator becomes the prey. Werner Herzog's film insisted on retaining this core theme in the late 70s. Then Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula film also altered the ending to make Mina instrumental in his demise, while also adding a romantic element to the relationship. Eggers has now integrated that romanticism into his version of Nosferatu. It's important not to over-romanticize this character here. Ultimately, Orlok has groomed Ellen since she was young and forced himself on her, which is objectively evil. I don't think any iteration of the story has ever questioned that. But there has been a concerted effort to add a doomed lover element to his character in later adaptations. Eggers and Coppola have executed this perfectly. They're not trying to vindicate Dracula, but they're humanizing him for the sake of character complexity. Eggers has openly stated that his film is, in a twisted sense, a love story, and Lily Rose Depp has even admitted there's a mutual yearning between their characters. This twisted romantic element changes the cause of Dracula's demise from over-ambition to love. He's still an abhorrent monster trying to force Ellen into a controlling relationship, but this underlying theme of irresistible lust and a transcendent connection pervades through her story. In the end, she accepts his love, but on her own terms, and the new film has one important distinction from its predecessors. When Orlok realizes he's fallen for her ploy, he doesn't protest or flee, like past iterations. He turns towards the daylight and accepts his fate, dying in the arms of his lover. His monstrous appearance and raspy voice gives him this sense of world weariness throughout the story, and in the end, it wasn't all in service of crafting a terrifying monster. It was to help us understand that in the end, Orlok got what he needed: peace. So, in a really twisted sense, the most monstrous depiction of Dracula is the one with the happiest ending. It's incredible that this ancient myth has lasted throughout civilization, literature, and cinema, and Nosferatu won't be the last story in the saga, but it certainly provides a cathartic ending to the journey. As with any character that gets constantly rebooted and readapted, there's going to be a lot more misses than hits, but in retrospect we can wade through the sea of misfires and find a thread linking definitive iterations, and recognize how they become a cultural touchstone and a turning point for that character. And through those stories, we can understand how our own civilization has evolved. Count Dracula and the broader vampire genre in general could give you a relatively good idea of how we've evolved as humans over the past century or two, if you're willing to look deep enough. Even in the time since I began writing this video, Sin has released and completely revolutionized the genre. It incorporates Celtic and African myth, utilizes classic tropes, and clearly draws inspiration from past vampire films like From Dusk Till Dawn. But it also introduced a musical side to vampires, and an incredibly nuanced social commentary around race relations and oppression in America. After over 100 years of vampire movies, we're still finding refreshing takes on the story. If you look back at some of the points we've covered, you'll see how this genre has survived so long and cemented itself in pop culture. Myths and tales were the equivalent to movies and shows before modern civilization. They had tropes, they had limitations that bred narrative tension, but most importantly, these tales benefited religion. They promoted belief in mankind's most dominant institution. In today's world, some would argue that corporations have now become that institution, and vampires aren't just a folktale, they're something much, much worse. Franchisable IP. Everyone knows what they are, so making a movie about them has a certain safety net. It's almost like a superhero movie. In some cases, they are literally superhero movies.
Have sex!
Vampires have fallen into a specific area of pop culture, an area mostly associated with gothicism, emos, Halloween, and horror. But there are two reasons why I believe they stand out among other myths and monsters. The first is that there is nothing so deeply disturbing to humanity as the idea of a disruption in the cycle of nature. It's the same reason that serial killers and cannibals are so profoundly terrifying to us as a society. Mankind has evolved to a point where we've been on top for centuries. In discovering that we're not at the top of our own food chain, and that there is another apex predator that lives among us, that looks like us, but isn't us and preys on us, is an idea that can shake us to the core. The other reason is that vampires embody a crucial message to our culture. Various modern iterations have taken some of their traits very literally, but as writer Fred Clark puts it, vampire stories tell us that any of us can have great power if we're only willing to prey on others. Feed off the blood of others and great power will be yours. This is demonstrably true. It's how the pyramids were built and Standard Oil. The mentality of a vampire is employed by those at the top of our food chain, the corrupt, the greedy, and many of the 1%. Entire cultures have been enslaved and massacred by a vampiric way of thinking, and so a story in which an everyday human can reject this doctrine is incredibly important. I think von Franz explains it very eloquently in the film.
We must know evil to be able to destroy it. We must discover it within ourselves.
Dracula is often disregarded by casual audiences as just another Halloween costume. He's no different than a werewolf or a witch or your friend wrapped in toilet paper. But this character has a rich history that shifts between reality and fiction. And more importantly, our culture has slowly been developing his internal journey for the past few centuries. The Robert Eggers film retells a story that's been told countless times before. But somehow, it manages to give Dracula a satisfying ending, one that acknowledges everything that's come before and explores his growth. Does the character deserve a happy ending? Definitely not. but this film neatly bookends a story that started at the dawn of our civilization, and it reflects how we as human beings have changed over millennia, from myths and beliefs to poems and novels to films and TV series. We've passed the torch from generation to generation to tell the story of a monster who reclaimed his humanity. While it might seem like dark subject matter, I find it strangely hopeful. Ironically, this tale of a demonic entity carries the same overarching themes as the religious institutions that fought against it. Redemption. If someone as deplorable as Count Dracula can find some kind of redemption, then perhaps we can as well.
I'm getting out of here. I'm going back to Waterloo where the vampires hang out.